Radioman Second Class. Joseph Rochefort Jr. sat hunched over his receiver at 0347 hours, his eyes burning from 6 consecutive hours, monitoring Japanese naval frequencies. The cramped, windowless room deep beneath the Pacific Fleet headquarters smelled of cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and the peculiar metallic odor of overheated radio equipment. Around him, 24 other radio men and cryptanalysts worked in near silence, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of typewriters and the occasional crackle of static from the receivers. Rochefort was not the famous Commander Joseph Rochefort, who had broken Japanese codes before Midway. He was the commander's nephew, assigned to Hypo 6 months earlier, fresh from radio school in San Diego. At 19 years old, he was one of the youngest men in the unit, and he felt the weight of his famous uncle's legacy every moment of every shift. The other radio men called him Junior, with a mixture of affection and skepticism. He had not yet proven himself worthy of the name he carried. The assignment that night was routine intercept work. Japanese naval communications had become increasingly difficult to decrypt since the summer of 1943, when Tokyo had introduced new code books and modified their encryption procedures. Station Hypo, which had been the crown jewel of American signals intelligence in the Pacific, had seen its effectiveness diminish dramatically. The cryptanalysts could still break some messages, but the process took days or weeks instead of hours. By the time a message was decoded, the intelligence it contained was often obsolete. Rochefort's specific task was to monitor frequency 49990 kHz, a band the Japanese Navy used for routine administrative traffic between shore stations and ships at sea. The messages were encrypted, of course, but the volume and timing of transmissions could reveal patterns. Traffic analysis, as this technique was called, could sometimes provide intelligence even when the actual content of messages remained unreadable. An increase in radio traffic from a particular base might indicate preparations for an operation. Changes in call signs might signal a reorganization of forces. The night had been quiet. Rochefort had logged 17 transmissions in 6 hours, all brief, all following standard Japanese communication protocols. His logbook recorded the time, frequency, signal strength, duration, and estimated location of each transmission. The work was tedious, requiring absolute concentration to distinguish genuine signals from atmospheric noise and to estimate locations through direction-finding techniques. His mind had begun to wander toward thoughts of breakfast and his bunk when, at 0347, a new signal emerged from the static. The transmission was different from the others. It lasted longer, approximately 4 minutes compared to the usual 30 to 60 seconds. The signal strength was weaker, suggesting a more distant transmitter. But what caught Rochefort's attention was the call sign. Japanese call signs followed predictable patterns, combinations of letters and numbers that identified the transmitting station and sometimes the type of unit. This call sign was unfamiliar, not matching any in the reference sheets posted above his receiver. Standard procedure required him to log the transmission and move on. The cryptanalysts would analyze the recording later, attempting to decrypt the message and identify the sender. But something about the signal nagged at Rochefort. The rhythm of the Morse code seemed irregular, as if the operator was inexperienced or working under difficult conditions. He made a decision that violated protocol. Instead of simply logging the transmission, he began tracking it with the direction-finding equipment. Direction finding, or DF, was a technique that used multiple receivers at different locations to triangulate the source of a radio transmission. Station Hypo had DF equipment, but it was normally operated by specialized technicians, not by intercept operators. Rochefort had received basic training on the equipment, but he was not authorized to use it without supervision. At 0347 on a quiet November morning, with the senior watch officer dozing in his office and the DF technician on a coffee break, Rochefort made his second protocol violation. He activated the DF system himself. The equipment was temperamental, a collection of antennas, receivers, and plotting boards that required careful calibration. Rochefort worked quickly, adjusting frequencies and taking bearings. The Japanese transmission continued, the operator sending groups of 5-digit numbers in the standard format of encrypted naval messages. Rochefort ignored the content, focusing entirely on the location. The first bearing placed the transmitter somewhere to the southwest. He switched to a second antenna array, took another bearing, and plotted the intersection on his chart. The result made him pause. According to his calculations, the transmission was originating from somewhere in the South China Sea, approximately 800 miles west of the Philippines. That location made no sense. Japanese naval communications from that region normally came from shore stations in Saigon, Manila, or Singapore, all of which had known call signs and operated on different frequencies. This signal was coming from the open ocean, from a ship or possibly a submarine. But why would a vessel in that location be transmitting a long encrypted message on an administrative frequency? Rochefort checked his calculations, worried he had made an error. Direction finding was as much art as science, subject to errors from atmospheric conditions, equipment calibration, and operator technique. But his second plot confirmed the first. The transmission was definitely coming from the South China Sea. He logged the information, noting his DF bearings and his estimate of the transmitter's location. Then he made his third and most significant protocol violation. He decided to track the signal actively, to see if he could refine the location or determine the transmitter's movement. For the next 40 minutes, Rochefort monitored frequency 4990, waiting for another transmission. Japanese radio operators typically worked in shifts, sending multiple messages during their assigned periods. If this was a ship or submarine, it would likely transmit again. At 0431, his patience was rewarded. The same call sign appeared, sending another long encrypted message. Rochefort immediately began taking DF bearings, working with an intensity that blocked out everything else in the room. This time, his plot showed the transmitter had moved. In the 44 minutes between transmissions, the source had shifted approximately 30 miles to the northeast. Rochefort felt his pulse quicken. A stationary shore station could not move. This was definitely a ship, and it was traveling at a speed he could calculate. 30 miles in 44 minutes meant a speed of approximately 41 knots. That was impossibly fast for a cargo ship or even most warships. Only destroyers and cruisers could sustain such speeds, and they rarely did so except in combat or emergency situations. But there was another possibility that Rochefort had not considered, one that would not occur to him until later. His calculation assumed the ship had traveled in a straight line between the two transmission points. If the ship had been traveling at an angle to his bearing lines, the actual speed could be different. If multiple ships were transmitting using the same call sign, which sometimes happened in Japanese naval practice, The apparent movement could be an illusion created by different vessels in different locations. These possibilities did not occur to the young radio man in the moment. He saw only what his calculations told him. A fast-moving vessel in an unexpected location, transmitting encrypted messages on an unusual frequency. The watch officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Farnsworth, emerged from his office at 0445, drawn by the unusual intensity of activity at Rochefort Station. Farnsworth was a career intelligence officer, 38 years old, who had served in naval communications since before the war. He had a reputation for being meticulous and by the book, qualities that made him an effective administrator, but sometimes frustrated the younger, more aggressive cryptanalysts. He approached Rochefort's station with the expression of a man who suspected regulations were being violated. "What are you doing with the DF equipment, Rochefort?" Farnsworth's voice carried the flat tone of a superior officer, who already knew the answer and disapproved. Rochefort stood, suddenly aware that his unauthorized use of equipment could result in disciplinary action. But he also knew he had discovered something potentially significant. He explained quickly, showing Farnsworth his logs, his plots, his calculations. He emphasized the unusual call sign, the unexpected location, the apparent high speed of the transmitter. Farnsworth studied the plots in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. "You violated protocol 3 times tonight, Rochefort. You used DF equipment without authorization. You tracked a target without orders. You abandoned your assigned monitoring duties." He paused, and Rochefort prepared himself for a reprimand. "You also may have discovered something important. I'm taking this to Commander Dyer immediately. You stay here and continue monitoring that frequency. If that call sign appears again, I want to know about it instantly." Commander Thomas Dyer had commanded Station Hypo's cryptanalysis section since Commander Joseph Rochefort's controversial reassignment to San Francisco in October 1942. Dyer was a different kind of intelligence officer than his predecessor. Where Rochefort Sr. had been intuitive and aggressive, willing to make bold predictions based on incomplete information, Dyer was methodical and cautious. He demanded multiple sources of confirmation before drawing conclusions. This approach had earned him respect from Admiral Nimitz's staff, but it had also slowed Hypo's analytical process at a time when Japanese code changes had already degraded American intelligence capabilities. Lieutenant Commander Farnsworth's briefing took 7 minutes. Dyer listened without interruption, studying the plots and logs that the young Rochefort had produced. When Farnsworth finished, Dyer asked the question that would define the next phase of the investigation. "What's your assessment? Is this a legitimate contact or an equipment malfunction?" It was the right question, the cautious question, the question that separated professional intelligence work from wishful thinking or paranoid fantasy. Farnsworth chose his words carefully. The DF bearings are consistent across multiple transmissions. The signal characteristics match Japanese naval communication protocols. The call sign is unfamiliar, but that's not unusual given how frequently they rotate their codes. The calculated speed is high, but not impossible for a warship. My assessment is that this is probably a legitimate contact, but we need more data to be certain. I recommend we continue monitoring and task additional DF stations to track this signal if it appears again. Dyer nodded slowly, his mind already working through the implications and the resources required. Station Haipo was not the only American signals intelligence facility in the Pacific. The Navy operated DF stations in Australia, Samoa, Midway, and along the Aleutian chain. The Army operated its own network of intercept stations. If this signal appeared again, multiple stations could take simultaneous bearings, producing a much more accurate location than a single station could achieve. But tasking multiple stations required justification, required convincing other commanders to divert resources based on one radioman's unauthorized tracking of an unidentified signal. Get me everything we have on Japanese naval activity in the South China Sea for the past month, Dyer ordered. I want to know what units are operating in that area, what their normal communication patterns are, and whether there's any operational intelligence that might explain a high-speed transit through that region. And get young Rochefort in here. I want to hear his assessment directly. Farnsworth departed, and Dyer turned to the large wall map of the Pacific that dominated his office. The South China Sea was marked with colored pins representing known Japanese bases, shipping routes, and recent contact reports. Joseph Rochefort Jr. entered the commander's office at 0547, still wearing his headphones around his neck, a habit that marked him as a radio man even out of uniform. He had never been in Dyer's office before. The room was larger than he expected, lined with filing cabinets and dominated by the huge map. Dyer did not look up from the documents he was studying. Sit down, Rochefort. Tell me about your training. How long have you been operating DF equipment? The question was a test, and Rochefort knew it. Sir, I completed basic DF training at radio school in San Diego. 40 hours of instruction, mostly classroom with some practical exercises. Since arriving at Haipo, I've observed DF operations approximately 20 times, but tonight was the first time I operated the equipment independently without direct supervision. He did not attempt to justify or excuse his actions. He simply stated the facts. Dyer finally looked up, his expression neutral. So you violated protocol based on 40 hours of training and 20 observations. That's either remarkably confident or remarkably stupid. Which is it? The question hung in the air. Rochefort understood that his answer would determine not just his immediate fate, but possibly his entire career in naval intelligence. He thought about his uncle, about the bold decisions that had led to victory at Midway, and subsequent reassignment when those decisions proved politically inconvenient. Sir, it was probably both, Rochefort said finally. The signal was unusual enough that I thought it warranted immediate investigation. I knew I was violating protocol, but I also knew that if I waited for proper authorization, the opportunity might be lost. In retrospect, I should have woken you or Commander Farnsworth immediately. But in the moment, I made the decision to act. If I was wrong, I accept responsibility and whatever consequences follow. Dyer studied the young man for a long moment. Your uncle made similar decisions. Some of them changed the course of the war. Others nearly ended his career. The difference between genius and insubordination is often just whether you happen to be right. He turned back to the map. Let's find out which category your decision falls into. I'm tasking 3 additional DF stations to monitor frequency 4990. If your mystery transmitter appears again, we'll get a proper fix on its location. You're assigned to coordinate the tracking. Consider it a field promotion to DF specialist, effective, immediately. Don't make me regret it. The next transmission appeared at EO823 hours during the morning watch change. Rochefort was still at his station, running on coffee and nervous energy. The same unfamiliar call sign emerged from the static, transmitting another long, encrypted message. This time, 4 DF stations tracked it simultaneously. Hypo in Hawaii, Station Cast in Melbourne, Station Able in Samoa, and a small army facility on Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. The multiple bearings converged on a location in the South China Sea, approximately 150 miles west of Palawan Island in the Philippines. The plot showed the transmitter had moved again, traveling approximately 240 miles northeast from its previous estimated position. The time between transmissions had been 3 hours and 52 minutes. Rochefort calculated the speed, approximately 62 knots. That was impossible. No ship in any navy could sustain 62 knots. The fastest destroyers in the world, the French Le Fantasque class, could reach 45 knots in ideal conditions. Even if the Japanese had developed some revolutionary new vessel, basic physics limited how fast a ship could move through water. Commander Dyer arrived at Rochefort's station within minutes of the transmission's end, summoned by a messenger. He studied the new plots in silence, comparing them with the earlier data. Either your DF equipment is malfunctioning, or you're tracking multiple ships using the same call sign, or something very strange is happening. What's your assessment? He directed the question at Rochefort, testing the young radioman's analytical thinking. Rochefort had been considering the same question. Sir, I think we're tracking multiple ships. The Japanese sometimes assign the same call sign to all vessels in a convoy or task force. If these transmissions are coming from different ships in a formation traveling northeast through the South China Sea, the apparent speed would be an artifact of our measurement method. We're not tracking one ship moving at impossible speeds. We're tracking the progression of multiple ships along a route. It was a brilliant insight, the kind of analytical leap that separated competent technicians from exceptional intelligence officers. Dyer felt a flash of recognition. The nephew had inherited more than just his uncle's name. If you're right, then we're not just tracking random transmissions. We're mapping a convoy route. The Japanese are using this call sign for vessels traveling along a specific path. Every time we intercept this signal, we're getting another data point on that route. He turned to Farnsworth, who had joined them. I want every transmission on frequency 4990 tracked and plotted for the past 6 months. If this is a convoy route, there should be a pattern. The analysis took 3 days. Every Radioman and crypt analyst at Station Hypo, who could be spared from other duties, was assigned to review archived intercept logs, searching for the unfamiliar call sign or similar signals on frequency 4990. The work was tedious, requiring them to sift through thousands of logged transmissions, most of which were routine and had been filed away without detailed analysis. But the effort produced results that exceeded even Dyer's expectations. The call sign that Rochefort had tracked appeared in archived logs dating back to July 1943. It had been intercepted sporadically, usually 2 or 3 times per week, always on frequency 4990, always transmitting long encrypted messages. Previous intercept operators had logged the transmissions, but had not tracked them with DF equipment, following standard protocol for routine administrative traffic. No one had recognized the pattern, because no one had been looking for it. When the archived transmissions were plotted on a map, a route emerged with startling clarity. The signals formed a path running from Singapore northeast through the South China Sea, passing west of Palawan, continuing north along the coast of Indochina, then turning east toward Formosa and the Japanese home islands. The route avoided the direct path through the Philippine archipelago, staying in deeper water where submarines were less of a threat. It was a convoy route exactly as Rochefort had theorized. But the route itself was not the most significant discovery. When the analysts examined the timing of the transmissions, another pattern emerged. The signals appeared in clusters, with multiple transmissions over a period of 12 to 18 hours, followed by silence for several days, then another cluster. The pattern suggested convoys departing Singapore every 5 to 7 days, traveling northeast along the established route, with ships in the convoy transmitting position reports or other operational messages as they progressed. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, arrived at Station Haipo on November 15th to review the findings. Layton was one of the Navy's most respected intelligence officers, a man who had correctly predicted Japanese movements before both the Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway. He studied the plots and analysis for over an hour before speaking. If this is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt it is, then you've discovered something of immense strategic value. The Japanese are moving supplies and reinforcements from Southeast Asia to their home islands and forward bases. This route represents a major logistics artery. If we can predict when convoys are using this route, we can position submarines to intercept them. The implications were profound. American submarines had been operating in the Pacific since the war's beginning, but their effectiveness had been limited by several factors. Torpedo problems had plagued the submarine force through 1942 and into 1943. More significantly, submarines often operated blindly, patrolling areas where enemy ships might appear, but with no specific intelligence about convoy schedules or routes. If Station Haipo could predict when Japanese convoys would be traveling along this newly discovered route, submarines could be positioned in advance, turning random patrols into planned ambushes. Admiral Chester Nimitz's morning intelligence briefing typically lasted 30 minutes and covered the entire Pacific theater. On this particular morning, Lieutenant Commander Layton requested an additional 15 minutes to present Station Haipo's findings about the convoy route. Nimitz listened to the briefing with the focused attention that characterized his command style, occasionally asking questions, but mostly allowing Layton to present the complete analysis before offering his assessment. The Admiral's conference room was sparse by the standards of flag officer accommodations. A large table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs that had seen years of service. Maps covered every wall, marked with colored pins and grease pencil notations, tracking the positions of American and Japanese forces across thousands of miles of ocean. Nimitz sat at the head of the table, flanked by his Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Charles McMorris, and his operations officer, Captain Ralph Parker. All three men were studying the route map that Layton had distributed. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," Nimitz said when Layton finished. "A 19-year-old radioman violated protocol 3 times in one night, and as a result, we've potentially discovered a major Japanese convoy route that we've been intercepting for months without recognizing its significance. Is that an accurate summary?" His tone was neutral, revealing neither approval nor disapproval. Nimitz had a reputation for judging results rather than methods, but he was also a stickler for proper procedure and chain of command. Layton chose his response carefully. "Admiral, that's accurate as far as it goes. But I would add that Commander Dyer recognized the significance of Rochefort's findings immediately and committed substantial resources to validating them. The analysis that followed was thorough and professional. We now have 4 months of data supporting the existence of this route. The pattern is consistent and statistically significant. This isn't speculation based on a single intercept. It's a documented pattern confirmed by multiple sources. Captain Parker leaned forward, his expression skeptical. But we still can't read the messages themselves, correct? We're inferring the existence of convoys based on radio traffic patterns and direction finding, but we don't actually know what these transmissions contain. They could be weather reports. They could be routine administrative messages. We're asking the Admiral to commit submarine assets based on traffic analysis, not on decrypted intelligence. It was a valid objection, the kind of cautious pushback that prevented intelligence organizations from overreaching or seeing patterns that did not exist. Parker was not hostile to the intelligence. He was doing his job, stress testing the analysis before operational resources were committed. Layton had anticipated the objection and had prepared his response. Captain, you're correct that we haven't decrypted the messages, but the pattern itself is intelligence. These transmissions appear every 5 to 7 days. They follow a consistent route from Singapore to the home islands, and they occur in clusters suggesting multiple ships traveling together. That's the definition of a convoy system. Rear Admiral McMorris, who had been silent until now, entered the discussion. The question isn't whether convoys exist. We know the Japanese are moving supplies from Southeast Asia. The question is whether this particular signal pattern reliably indicates convoy movements, and whether that intelligence is actionable. Even if we position submarines along this route, the ocean is vast. Without more precise information about convoy composition, speed, and timing, we're still asking our boats to search large areas with limited probability of contact. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with Parker and McMorris raising legitimate concerns about the reliability of the intelligence and the operational challenges of exploiting it. Nimitz listened to all arguments before rendering his decision. Here's what we're going to do. Commander Dyer will continue monitoring this frequency and refining the analysis. I want to know everything possible about the timing, frequency, and characteristics of these transmissions. Captain Parker, you'll work with Submarine Command to identify 2 boats that can be positioned along this route for a trial period of 2 weeks. We'll treat this as an experiment. If the intelligence proves accurate and our submarines make contact, we'll expand the operation. If not, we'll reassess. It was a characteristically Nimitz decision, cautious enough to limit risk, aggressive enough to exploit potential opportunity, and structured as a test that would generate data for future decisions. Layton left the briefing satisfied. He had not received everything he wanted, but he had received enough to prove the concept. 2 submarines, 2 weeks. If Rochefort's discovery was as significant as Layton believed, those 2 boats would have opportunities to demonstrate it. The selection of submarines for the experimental operation fell to Captain John Cromwell, who commanded Submarine Division 43. Cromwell was a meticulous officer who had spent most of his career in submarines and understood both their capabilities and limitations. He reviewed the intelligence package that Layton provided, studied the route map, and considered which boats under his command were best positioned to exploit the opportunity. His choice fell on USS Pargo and USS Pito, both Gato-class submarines that were completing refit at Pearl Harbor and scheduled to depart for patrol in the South China Sea. Lieutenant Commander David Bell White, commanding officer of USS Pargo, received his patrol orders on November 18th. The orders were unusual in their specificity. Most submarine patrol orders designated a general area and left the details of patrol patterns to the commanding officer's discretion. These orders directed White to position Pargo along a specific route west of Palawan Island and to maintain station there for 14 days, monitoring for Japanese convoy traffic. The orders included the intelligence assessment from Station Hypo, complete with the route map and timing analysis. White studied the orders with mixed feelings. On one hand, specific intelligence about enemy movements was exactly what submarine commanders wanted. The alternative was random patrolling, covering vast areas of ocean with low probability of contact. On the other hand, the intelligence was based on radio traffic analysis, not on decrypted messages or visual reconnaissance. White had been in submarines long enough to know that intelligence could be wrong, and positioning his boat based on faulty intelligence meant wasting patrol time and fuel in an empty ocean. He called his executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Simons, to his cabin to review the orders. Simons was younger than White, only 26 years old, but he had already completed 4 war patrols and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. He read through the intelligence package quickly, then looked up with an expression that White had learned to recognize as barely contained enthusiasm. "Skipper, if this is accurate, we're going to have target-rich environment. A convoy route that's been operating for months, and we're the first boat positioned to exploit it? This could be the patrol we've been waiting for." White appreciated his XO's optimism, but felt obligated to inject a note of caution. It could also be a wild goose chase based on some radioman's misinterpretation of signals. We're committing 2 weeks of patrol time to sit in one location based on traffic analysis. If the intelligence is wrong, we're wasting fuel and opportunity. I want you to understand that before we get underway. This is an experiment, and experiments sometimes fail. Simons nodded, but his enthusiasm was undimmed. White recognized the expression. It was the look of a young officer who believed he was about to participate in something significant. USS Pargo departed Pearl Harbor on November 20th, 1943, at 800 hours. The submarine slipped through the harbor entrance and submerged once clear of the defensive nets, beginning the long transit to the patrol area west of Palawan. The voyage would take 8 days, traveling submerged during daylight hours and surfacing at night to run on diesel engines and recharge batteries. White used the transit time to drill his crew on attack procedures and to study the intelligence package in detail, looking for any additional insights that might improve his chances of success. The intelligence package included more than just the route map. Station Hypo had provided an analysis of transmission timing that suggested convoys typically passed through the patrol area during a specific window, between 600 and 1800 hours, with peak probability around midday. The analysis was based on the timing of radio transmissions and the calculated speed of convoy movements. White found himself impressed by the thoroughness of the analysis, even as he remained skeptical about its accuracy. Intelligence officers could produce beautiful reports, but the ocean did not always cooperate with their predictions. USS Pito, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Hazard, departed Pearl Harbor 12 hours after Pargo. Hazard had received identical orders and had reached similar conclusions about the operation's experimental nature. The two submarines would patrol separate sections of the route, positioned approximately 60 miles apart, maximizing the probability that at least one boat would make contact if convoys were using the route as predicted. Radio communication between the submarines would be minimal to avoid detection, but both boats would report their observations to Pearl Harbor at scheduled intervals. Back at Station Hypo, Joseph Rochefort, Jr. had been assigned to monitor frequency 4990 full-time, tracking every transmission and refining the analysis of convoy timing. Commander Dyer had created a dedicated team to support the submarine operation, with Rochefort as the primary analyst. The young radio man felt the weight of responsibility. Two submarines and their crews were now positioned based largely on his initial discovery. If the intelligence proved wrong, if no convoys appeared, the failure would be attributed to him. His unauthorized use of DF equipment would be remembered not as initiative, but as recklessness. The first test came on November 28th, when Station Hypo intercepted a cluster of transmissions using the familiar call sign. The signals appeared at 0615, 0847, and 10:23 hours, all originating from locations along the predicted route. Rochefort tracked each transmission, plotting the positions and calculating the progression. The pattern matched previous observations. Multiple ships transmitting as they moved northeast through the South China Sea. Based on the timing and positions, Rochefort estimated that the convoy would reach Pargo's patrol area around 1400 hours that afternoon. Commander Dyer reviewed Rochefort's analysis and made the decision to transmit a warning to Pargo. The message was brief, encrypted, and sent via low-frequency transmission that the submarine could receive while submerged. Possible convoy approaching your area from southwest. Estimated arrival 1400 hours. Multiple contacts likely. The message was transmitted at 11:47 hours. Whether Pargo received it, and whether the prediction was accurate, would not be known for hours, or possibly days. Submarines on patrol maintained radio silence except for critical reports, and contact reports were only sent after attacks were completed or when breaking contact with the enemy. Lieutenant Commander White received the message at 1203 hours, while Pargo was running submerged at periscope depth. The radio operator delivered the decoded message to the control room, where White was standing watch. He read it twice, then checked his navigation plot. Pargo was positioned exactly where the patrol orders had specified, approximately 40 miles west of Palawan Island, in water deep enough for maneuvering, but shallow enough that periscope observations were practical. If the intelligence was accurate, a convoy would appear from the southwest within the next 2 hours. White ordered the submarine to battle stations at 1330 hours, giving his crew 30 minutes to prepare before the estimated contact time. The transition was smooth, practiced through countless drills. Torpedomen checked their weapons, ensuring all 6 bow tubes and 4 stern tubes were loaded and ready. The fire control team manned their stations, preparing the mechanical computers that would calculate firing solutions. White positioned himself at the periscope, beginning a systematic search of the southwestern horizon. The ocean was calm, visibility excellent. If ships were approaching, he would see them. At 14:07 hours, 3 minutes past the estimated arrival time, White saw smoke on the horizon. The smoke appeared as thin gray smudges against the pale afternoon sky, barely distinguishable from clouds at first glance. Lieutenant Commander White kept his eye pressed to the periscope, counting the smoke columns, while his executive officer, Lieutenant Simons, stood ready with binoculars for the moment when White would step back and allow him to observe. I count 4 distinct smoke sources bearing 215 degrees. Range is difficult to estimate, but I'd say at least 12 miles, possibly 15. They're heading northeast, consistent with the predicted route. White stepped back from the periscope, and Simons immediately took his place. The control room was silent except for the quiet hum of electric motors and the occasional whispered report from the sonar operator. Every man aboard understood what those smoke columns represented. After weeks of preparation, after 8 days of transit, after 2 days of waiting in the patrol area, the intelligence had proven accurate. A Japanese convoy was approaching exactly when and where Station Haipuo had predicted it would appear. The fire control team began their calculations, using the bearing and estimated range to plot an intercept course. The problem was complex, requiring them to predict where the convoy would be when Pargo's torpedoes arrived, accounting for the submarine's speed, the target's speed and course, and the running time of the torpedoes themselves. The mechanical computers that performed these calculations were marvels of pre-electronic engineering, but they required accurate input data. White needed to get closer, needed to identify the convoy's composition, and measure its speed precisely before committing to an attack. "Ahead 1/3, come right to course 230, White ordered. Pargo began moving toward the convoy at 3 knots, slow enough to minimize the periscope wake that might betray the submarine's presence to alert lookouts. White raised the periscope every 3 minutes for quick observations, never leaving it up for more than 10 seconds at a time. The fundamental challenge of submarine warfare was that the periscope, the submarine's only window to the surface world, was also its greatest vulnerability. A periscope wake, or the glint of sunlight on the lens, could alert an escort vessel, bringing depth charges that could destroy the submarine before it ever fired a shot. Over the next 40 minutes, the convoy's composition became clear. White counted 6 merchant ships arranged in 2 columns of 3 ships each, with 4 escort vessels providing protection. The escorts were destroyers, or possibly destroyer escorts, smaller vessels designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare. They moved in a pattern around the merchant ships, constantly changing position to make it difficult for a submarine to predict their locations. It was a well-organized convoy, professionally escorted, exactly the kind of target that submarine commanders dreamed about and also feared. The merchant ships were large, probably cargo vessels or tankers in the 8,000 to 10,000 ton range. At 14:53 hours, when the convoy had closed to approximately 8,000 yards, White could see details through the periscope. The lead ship in the port column appeared to be a tanker, riding high in the water, suggesting it was either empty or only partially loaded. The lead ship in the starboard column was definitely a cargo vessel, sitting lower in the water, probably fully loaded. The other 4 ships were similar cargo vessels, all heading northeast at what White estimated to be 12 knots. White faced the classic submarine commander's dilemma. He could attack now, from a range of 8,000 yards, firing a spread of torpedoes at the nearest targets, and then diving deep to evade the inevitable counterattack from the escorts. Or he could wait, allowing the convoy to close further, improving his chances of hitting multiple targets. but also increasing the risk that the escorts would detect Pargo before the attack. The decision required balancing aggression against caution, opportunity against survival. "We're going to let them close to 4,000 yards, White announced. "I want a firing solution on the lead cargo ship in the starboard column. That's our primary target. Secondary target is the ship immediately behind it. We'll fire a 4-torpedo spread at the primary, then shift to the secondary, if we have time before the escorts react." Questions? There were none. The crew had trained for this scenario dozens of times. They knew their roles, knew the risks, knew that the next 30 minutes would determine whether this patrol was remembered as a success or a failure. The convoy continued its approach, the merchant ships maintaining their formation, while the escorts wove their protective pattern. White watched through the periscope, timing his observations to coincide with moments when the nearest escort was turned away or obscured by the merchant ships. At 15:21 hours, with the range down to 4,200 yards, he made his final observation before the attack. The lead cargo ship in the starboard column was clearly visible, a large vessel with a distinctive superstructure amidships. White could see crew members on deck, could see cargo booms and ventilators, could see the ship's wake as it plowed through the calm sea. "Final bearing and shoot," White ordered. The fire control team made their last adjustments to the torpedo data computer. "Bearing mark!" White called out the bearing to the target. "Range 4100 yards. Angle on the bow starboard 30. Speed 12 knots. The fire control officer repeated the data, confirming the solution was set. "Solution ready," he reported. "Outer doors are open. Tubes 1 through 4 are ready to fire." White took one last look through the periscope, confirming the target's position. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air ejected the first torpedo from its tube. Fire 2. Another shudder. Fire 3. Fire 4. 4 Mark 14 torpedoes were now running toward the target, spread across a 150-yard pattern to account for any errors in the firing solution. Each torpedo carried a 643-pound warhead and ran at 46 knots. The running time to the target would be approximately 3 minutes. Downscope, take her down to 150 feet, rig for depth charge, rig for silent running. White's orders came rapidly, and the crew executed them with practiced efficiency. Pargo's bow tilted downward as the diving officer flooded negative tank and pushed the diving planes to their stops. The submarine descended quickly, seeking the safety of depth before the escorts could react. In the control room, men secured equipment and braced themselves for the counterattack they knew was coming. The first explosion came at 15:24 hours and 32 seconds, exactly as the fire control team had calculated. The sound of the detonation reached Pargo as a deep, resonant boom that reverberated through the hull. 5 seconds later, a second explosion, then a third. 3 hits out of 4 torpedoes, an exceptional result that exceeded even White's optimistic expectations. The sonar operator reported breaking up noises, the distinctive sounds of a ship's hull collapsing as water flooded its compartments. The primary target was sinking. But there was no time to celebrate. The escorts reacted immediately, their propellers audible through Pargo's hull as they increased speed and turned toward the submarine's firing position. White had anticipated this response. The escorts would converge on the point where the torpedoes had originated, using sonar to search for the submarine and dropping depth charges to destroy or drive it away. Pargo's survival now depended on how quickly it could move away from the firing position and how effectively it could evade the hunters. "Left full rudder, all ahead full," White ordered. Pargo turned sharply and accelerated to its maximum submerged speed of 8 knots, opening the distance from the firing position. The submarine's electric motors were quieter than diesel engines, but they were not silent. The escort's sonar operators would be listening for any sound that might reveal the submarine's location. In the control room, the crew maintained absolute silence, communicating only through hand signals and whispered words when necessary. The first depth charge exploded at 15:27 hours, approximately 400 yards astern of Pargo's current position. The explosion was loud, but not dangerously close. White allowed himself a moment of relief. The escorts were attacking the firing position, exactly as he had hoped. But that relief was premature. Over the next 15 minutes, the escorts dropped 23 depth charges in a systematic search pattern, walking their attacks closer to Pargo's actual position. Several explosions were close enough to shake the submarine violently, knocking loose equipment and extinguishing lights. At 15:43 hours, a depth charge exploded less than 100 yards from Pargo's starboard side. The detonation was catastrophic in its intensity, a hammer blow that seemed to compress the entire submarine. Light bulbs shattered throughout the boat. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. In the after-torpedo room, a pipe fitting cracked, sending a high-pressure stream of seawater into the compartment. The crew reacted instantly, isolating the leak and shoring up the damaged fitting. But the incident reminded everyone aboard how fragile their steel cocoon was when subjected to the crushing force of underwater explosions. White maintained his course and speed, resisting the temptation to change direction or depth. Erratic maneuvering might seem like the logical response to a depth charge attack, but it could also make the submarine easier to track. The escort's sonar operators were listening for any change in the submarine's sound signature that might reveal its location. By maintaining a steady course and speed, White hoped to blend into the ocean's background noise, becoming invisible to the hunters above. The depth charging continued for another hour, but the explosions gradually moved away as the escorts expanded their search pattern. By 1700 hours, the sounds of propellers and explosions had faded to the point where White felt confident enough to come to periscope depth for a quick observation. What he saw confirmed the success of the attack. One merchant ship was gone, leaving only an oil slick and floating debris. The remaining 5 merchant ships had scattered, abandoning their neat formation in favor of individual courses that would make them harder to target. The escorts were still searching, but they had moved several miles away from Pargo's position. White ordered the submarine to remain submerged until dark, then surface to transmit a contact report and recharge batteries. The crew secured from battle stations, and the tension that had gripped the boat for the past 2 hours began to ease. Men spoke in normal voices again, allowed themselves to smile, began to process what they had just experienced. They had attacked a Japanese convoy based on intelligence from radio intercepts, and the intelligence had been accurate. More than accurate, it had been perfect. The contact report was transmitted at 2147 hours, after Pargo had surfaced under cover of darkness. The message was brief and factual. Attacked convoy position 915N 11842E at 1521 hours. 4 torpedoes fired. 3 hits observed on cargo vessel estimated 8,000 tons. Target sank. 5 additional merchants and 4 escorts present. Evaded counterattack. No damage to Pargo. Remaining in patrol area. The message was received at Pearl Harbor at 22:03 hours and immediately forwarded to Admiral Nimitz's headquarters and to Station High PO. Joseph Rochefort Jr. had not slept. He had remained at his station through the night, monitoring frequency 4990 and waiting for confirmation that his analysis had been correct. When the contact report from USS Pargo arrived, decoded and delivered to Commander Dyer's office at 22:15 hours the previous evening, Dyer had immediately walked to Rochefort's station to share the news. The young radioman's reaction had been subdued, almost anticlimactic. He had simply nodded, said, "Thank you, sir," and returned his attention to his receiver. But Dyer had seen the slight tremor in Rochefort's hands, had recognized the emotional release that the young man was struggling to contain. Now, in the gray light of dawn, Rochefort sat at his station, tracking another cluster of transmissions on frequency 4990. The pattern was repeating itself. 5 days after the previous convoy, another series of signals was progressing northeast along the same route. The call sign was identical. The timing was consistent with previous observations. Based on the transmission locations and timing, Rochefort calculated that this convoy would reach the patrol area where USS Pito was stationed around 1100 hours that morning. Commander Dyer arrived at 0645, earlier than his usual schedule, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Rochefort without comment and studied the plots that the young radio man had been updating throughout the night. "How confident are you in this prediction?" Dyer asked. It was the question that intelligence officers always had to answer, the question that separated analysis from guesswork. Rochefort had learned enough in the past 2 weeks to understand that confidence had to be calibrated, that certainty was rare in intelligence work. "Sir, the pattern matches the previous convoy exactly. Same call sign, same route, same timing, relative to the last convoy. If the pattern holds, and I believe it will, then a convoy should reach Pito's area around 1100 hours, plus or minus 30 minutes to account for variations in speed and course. I'd estimate 85% confidence." Rochefort had learned to quantify his assessments, to give commanders a basis for decision-making, rather than just intuitive judgments. Dyer nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. 85% is high confidence in this business. We'll send the warning to Pito. If you're right twice in a row, this operation moves from experimental to operational. Admiral Nimitz will commit more boats to this route, and your discovery becomes a permanent part of our intelligence collection effort. If you're wrong. He left the sentence unfinished, but Rochefort understood the implication. 1 success could be luck. 2 successes established a pattern. But a failure after a success would raise questions about whether the first success had indeed been luck rather than valid intelligence. The warning message was transmitted to USS Pito at 0715 hours. Possible convoy approaching from southwest. Estimated arrival, your area 1100 hours. Multiple contacts likely. Previous intelligence proved accurate. Pargo sank 1 cargo vessel from similar convoy 28 November. The addition of information about Pargo's success was deliberate, intended to bolster Lieutenant Commander Hazard's confidence in the intelligence and encourage aggressive action. USS Pito was positioned approximately 60 miles northeast of where Pargo had made its attack, covering a different section of the convoy route. Lieutenant Commander William Hazard had been monitoring radio traffic and had learned of Pargo's success through the contact report that had been broadcast to all submarines in the area. The news had energized his crew, transforming their patrol from a speculative experiment into a proven hunting ground. When the warning message arrived, predicting another convoy, Hazard felt a surge of anticipation mixed with pressure. Pargo had proven the intelligence was valid. Now it was Pito's turn to demonstrate that the success was repeatable. At 10:47 hours, Pito's lookouts spotted smoke on the southwestern horizon. Hazard was on the bridge when the report came, and he immediately ordered the submarine to dive and proceed toward the contact at periscope depth. The timing was 13 minutes earlier than the prediction, well within the margin of error that Rochefort had specified. As Pito closed the range, the convoy's composition became visible. 7 merchant ships, with 5 escorts, slightly larger than the convoy Pargo had attacked. Hazard's approach was more aggressive than White's had been. Perhaps emboldened by Pargo's success, perhaps driven by competitive instinct, Hazard closed to 3,000 yards before attacking, a range that offered better accuracy, but also increased the risk of detection. At 11:34 hours, Pito fired 6 torpedoes in a spread aimed at 2 different targets, 4 torpedoes at a large tanker, and 2 at a cargo vessel. The firing solution was nearly perfect. 5 of the 6 torpedoes hit their targets, sinking the tanker and severely damaging the cargo vessel. The escort's counterattack was immediate and ferocious. Unlike the escorts that had pursued Pargo, these destroyers were more experienced or more determined. They maintained contact with Pito for over 3 hours, dropping 67 depth charges in a relentless pursuit that pushed the submarine and its crew to their limits. Several charges exploded close enough to cause significant damage: a hydraulic leak in the bow planes, a cracked battery cell that released chlorine gas, and damage to the sound gear that left Pito partially deaf to the threats around it. But Pito survived. Hazard's skillful maneuvering and his crew's damage control efforts kept the submarine operational, and eventually the escorts broke off their attack, possibly running low on depth charges or called away to protect the surviving merchant ships. Pito surfaced after dark, transmitted its contact report, and began the process of assessing damage and making repairs. The message that reached Pearl Harbor at 2331 hours reported 2 ships sunk or damaged, but also detailed the extensive damage Pito had sustained. The submarine would need to cut short its patrol and return to base for repairs. The 2 successful attacks within 48 hours transformed the experimental operation into a validated intelligence capability. Admiral Nimitz's morning briefing on November 30th focused almost entirely on the convoy route and how to exploit it more systematically. Captain Parker, who had been skeptical during the initial briefing, was now advocating for positioning additional submarines along the route. "We've proven the intelligence is accurate and actionable. We should have boats stationed at intervals along the entire route from Singapore to Formosa. Every convoy that uses this route should face multiple submarine attacks." But Lieutenant Commander Layton urged caution. "We need to consider the sustainability of this operation. The Japanese aren't stupid. After losing 3 ships in 2 days, they're going to investigate why. They may discover that their radio transmissions are being tracked. If they change their communication procedures or their route, we lose this advantage. We need to exploit the intelligence, but we also need to be careful not to compromise the source through overuse." It was the eternal tension in intelligence operations, the conflict between exploitation and protection. Intelligence that was never used had no value, but intelligence that was used too obviously could be compromised, alerting the enemy to change their procedures and eliminating future opportunities. Nimitz understood this tension instinctively. "We'll position 4 submarines along the route, spaced to provide coverage without saturation. We'll limit attacks to 1 or 2 ships per convoy, enough to inflict damage, but not so much that it's obviously the result of specific intelligence. And we'll monitor Japanese reactions carefully. If they change their procedures, we adapt." The decision represented a middle path between aggressive exploitation and careful protection, typical of Nimitz's balanced approach to command. 4 submarines were assigned to patrol the route: USS Rasher, USS Rayton, USS Ray, and USS Redfin, all positioned at intervals that would allow them to intercept convoys without concentrating so many boats that the Japanese would recognize a pattern. The submarines were given specific instructions about attack procedures: limit attacks to 1 or 2 ships per convoy, vary the time of day and position of attacks, and avoid pursuing damaged ships if doing so would expose the submarine to excessive risk. Station Hypo's role evolved from experimental intelligence collection to operational support. Commander Dyer established a dedicated watch section responsible for monitoring frequency 4990 and tracking convoy movements. Rochefort was promoted to chief of the section, a responsibility that came with both authority and pressure. He was now responsible not just for tracking transmissions, but for predicting convoy movements with enough accuracy that submarines could be positioned effectively. The margin for error was small. Submarines had limited fuel and patrol time. Positioning them incorrectly meant wasted opportunities and potentially endangered crews. The operation's success created unexpected challenges. Other intelligence organizations wanted access to the information. The Army's Signals Intelligence Units requested details about the intercept procedures. The British liaison officers at Pearl Harbor asked for information to share with their own submarine forces operating in Southeast Asian waters. Each request had to be evaluated carefully, balancing the benefits of cooperation against the risks of compromising the source. Dyer found himself spending as much time managing information security as analyzing intelligence. The Japanese reaction to the submarine attacks was slower than expected. Convoys continued using the route through December, though with some modifications. The escorts became more numerous and more aggressive. Some convoys began traveling at night, making them harder to detect visually, but not affecting the radio transmissions that allowed Station Hypo to track them. The call sign changed in mid-December, but the new call sign was quickly identified and added to the tracking system. The route itself remained essentially unchanged, suggesting the Japanese had not yet connected their losses to a compromise of their communications. By the end of December 1943, American submarines had sunk or damaged 17 Japanese ships along the convoy route, a success rate that exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. The tonnage sunk represented a significant blow to Japanese logistics, disrupting the flow of raw materials from Southeast Asia to the home islands. Oil, rubber, tin, and other strategic materials that Japan desperately needed were now resting on the bottom of the South China Sea. The economic impact was difficult to quantify precisely, but intelligence analysts estimated that the losses were equivalent to removing approximately 15% of Japan's merchant shipping capacity from service. The human cost was also significant. though harder to measure. Thousands of Japanese merchant seamen died when their ships were torpedoed. Some were killed instantly in the explosions. Others drowned when their ships sank too quickly for lifeboats to be launched. Still others died of exposure or thirst while floating in the open ocean, waiting for rescue that sometimes never came. American submarine commanders rarely witnessed these deaths directly. They saw ships sink and then departed the area, leaving the survivors to their fate. It was a brutal calculus of war, one that submariners tried not to dwell on. The success also had an unexpected effect on Joseph Rochefort Jr.'s career and reputation. The young radio man who had violated protocol on a November night had become, by the end of December, one of the most valuable intelligence analysts in the Pacific. Officers who had initially dismissed him as Junior, trading on his uncle's famous name, now sought his assessments and predictions. He was invited to briefings at fleet headquarters, asked to train other analysts in traffic analysis techniques, and mentioned in dispatches as a key contributor to the submarine campaign. But success brought its own pressures. Rochefort found himself working 16-hour days, monitoring transmissions, refining predictions, and second-guessing every assessment. The knowledge that submarine crews were risking their lives based on his analysis weighed heavily on him. When a submarine failed to make contact with a predicted convoy, he wondered if his calculations had been wrong. When a submarine was damaged in a counterattack, he wondered if his intelligence had been too aggressive, encouraging commanders to take excessive risks. Joseph Rochefort Jr. sat alone in the darkened analysis room, surrounded by 4 months of convoy tracking data spread across 3 tables. The operation had exceeded every expectation. 31 Japanese ships sunk, countless tons of strategic materials denied to the enemy, and not a single American submarine lost while operating on intelligence he had provided. By any objective measure, it was a triumph. But tonight, the weight of that success felt crushing. The message had arrived 2 hours earlier. USS Scorpion was overdue and presumed lost. The submarine had been operating along the convoy route, positioned based on Rochefort's latest analysis. The last transmission had been a contact report indicating a convoy sighting. Then silence. Search aircraft had found an oil slick and debris field. 84 men were gone. Rochefort knew intellectually that Scorpion's loss might not be related to his intelligence. Submarines faced countless dangers: mechanical failures, mines, aircraft, surface ships. But the timing was impossible to ignore. The boat had been where he had told them to go, hunting targets he had identified. Whether his analysis had directly caused their deaths or simply placed them in harm's way, the result was the same. Commander Dyer found him there at dawn, staring at the maps without seeing them. The older officer said nothing at first, just placed a hand on Rocherov's shoulder. Finally, "Your uncle once told me that intelligence work means living with uncertainty and responsibility in equal measure. We give commanders the best information we can, knowing that men will die based on our assessments. Sometimes those men die because our intelligence was wrong. Sometimes they die despite our intelligence being right. The burden is the same either way." "Does it get easier?" Rochefort asked quietly. "No," Dyer said. "But you learn to carry it. And you remember that more men would die without the intelligence we provide. Scorpion's crew knew the risks. Every submariner does. They went into danger with the best information we could give them. That's all we can ever do." The convoy route operation continued, but with modifications. Admiral Nimitz ordered a temporary reduction in submarine deployments, allowing the Japanese to rebuild their confidence while Station Haipyo refined their procedures. The intelligence had been so successful that it risked becoming obvious. Better to step back, let the enemy relax, then resume operations with renewed surprise. Rochefort used the pause to train other analysts, documenting the techniques he had developed through intuition and necessity. The unauthorized DF tracking that had started everything became standard procedure, codified in official protocols. His traffic analysis methods were distributed to other intelligence stations across the Pacific. What had begun as one radioman's violation of protocol had evolved into a systematic intelligence capability. In May 1944, Joseph Rochefort Jr. received orders transferring him to Washington for assignment to the Navy's Cryptanalysis School as an instructor. It was a promotion, recognition of his contributions, and also a gentle removal from operational intelligence work. He was 20 years old and had helped sink 31 enemy ships. The Navy wanted to preserve his expertise while giving him time to mature, before returning him to the sharp end of intelligence operations. His last night at Station Haipyo, Rochefort stood outside the dungeon, looking up at the stars over Pearl Harbor. He thought about the convoy route, about the ships that had sunk, about the men who had died on both sides because of intelligence he had provided. He thought about his uncle, who had made similar calculations before Midway, who had lived with similar burdens. Commander Dyer emerged from the building, carrying 2 cups of coffee in the tradition that had developed between them. "Your uncle would be proud," he said. "You found a pattern no one else saw. You had the courage to act on it. And you helped win a small piece of a very large war." "At what cost?" Rochefort asked. "At the only cost that matters in war," Dyer replied. "Less than the alternative would have been." They stood in silence, drinking coffee and watching the dawn break over the Pacific. In the distance, submarines were preparing for patrol, carrying torpedoes and intelligence that would send more ships to the bottom. The war would continue with or without Joseph Rochefort Jr. The convoy route would be tracked by other analysts, attacked by other submarines. The pattern he had discovered would be exploited until the Japanese finally changed their procedures or the war ended. But for this moment, in the quiet before dawn, Rochefort allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. The triumph and the tragedy, the success and the cost, the pride and the guilt. He was no longer the eager young radio man who had violated protocol on a November night. He was an intelligence officer who understood that information was power, and power always came with a price. The sun rose over Pearl Harbor, illuminating the harbor where the war had begun for America. Rochefort finished his coffee, straightened his uniform, and walked back into the dungeon. There was still work to do, still convoys to track, still intelligence to provide. The burden would always be there, but so would the duty. And in the end, duty was enough.